A very warm welcome to this evening's event. Very pleased to see you here and to welcome two very distinguished guests to this evening's Ideas and Society event, hosted very proudly by La Trobe University. Here at Federation Square, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the lands of the Kulin nations, and we respect their traditions and embrace their traditional and contemporary expression. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who might be with us in the audience this evening. La Trobe University is indeed very proud to be hosting this evening's event. We are hosting a series of debates and public lectures with leading thinkers and public figures as part of our Ideas and Society program this year. This year, under the expert convenership of our La Trobe Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, we pose the question, a better Australia? Can we become a better Australia? If yes, how? And how might that manifest itself in different spheres of society? So far this year, you may have been part of the series, but if not, let me draw your attention to the fact that earlier this year we hosted Tim Costello and Connie Lenneberg, who considered why in recent years Australia has failed to fulfil its regional and global responsibilities. We also hosted Gillian Triggs, former President of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, and Julian Burnside, one of our most eloquent asylum seeker advocates. Just last month, Noel Pearson, who some regard as Australia's one of our most original thinkers, and Megan Davis, a distinguished younger Indigenous leader, outlined prospects for long-delayed Indigenous constitutional recognition. And of course, we also recognise that NAIDOC Week has just concluded with the very fitting theme of Because of Her, We Can, recognising the invaluable contribution of Indigenous women to our societies and communities. Our Indigenous women have indeed played a critical role in making a better Australia. There are 3 more events to come this year, later this year, and I do encourage you to stay tuned and join us for the September event. But let's focus on this evening. We have posed the question, a better Australia? Challenges facing Australian governance. Many Australians believe that our country could behave more generously and justly, both at home and abroad. Some have lost confidence in our politicians and in our political system. Globally, the moral ascendancy of democracy as the preferred political system is challenged by the economic rise of countries such as China and events such as the financial crisis of 2007-8. Emergent democracies in the Middle East and Eastern Europe have struggled and, in many cases, collapsed. Deep doubts have been sown about the capacity of political leaders to govern effectively, evident in the electoral outcomes in several established democracies. The very notions of truth and fact in political life regularly become personal and instrumental constructions. Tonight we have 2 very distinguished guests, 2 of Australia's most incisive thinkers and commentators who will address the topic of the challenges facing Australian governance. I'd like to welcome the Honourable Kevin Rudd and Terry Moran AC. They need no introduction, but I am just going to take a few moments to outline just a few of the significant achievements of these 2 distinguished guests. Kevin Rudd was, of course, Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010 and in 2013, and Foreign Minister in 2010 to 12. Mr. Rudd joined the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York as its inaugural president in January 2015. And from 2014 to 16, he was chair of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, where he led a major review of the United Nations system. In 2014, Mr. Rudd was a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he completed a major policy paper entitled US-China 21, The Future of US-China Relations under Xi Jinping. Turning to Terry Moran AC, he has worked with several Australian federal and state governments and held senior roles in public policy development and implementation and public sector management. We're very proud of the fact that Mr. Moran is also an alumnus of La Trobe University. That cannot go unnoticed. He graduated from La Trobe with a Bachelor of Arts with honours in 1972, and he's had a distinguished career in the Australian and Victorian public sectors. Mr. Moran was the first Chief Executive Officer of the Australian National Training Authority and was the Director General of Education Queensland from 1998 to 2000. He was appointed Secretary of the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet in 2000, a position he held until 2008. And Mr. Moran was then appointed Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the most senior position in the Australian Public Service. He held that position from 2008 to 2011. And he currently holds the chair of the Centre for Policy Development, one of Australia's leading independent policy institutes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see from tonight's program that we are indeed breaking new ground. Mr. Rudd just asked this question earlier. Have we ever had a former Prime Minister and his Deputy Secretary Department Secretary in the same forum and in conversation? I don't believe we have. So we believe we're breaking new ground tonight, as La Trobe loves to do. So tonight we're going to be in for a treat to hear Kevin and Terry in conversation, as it were. We'll listen in on their views about challenges facing Australian governance and whether or not there is any prospect for a better Australia. After a period of time, 30 to 40 minutes of conversation, be prepared for me to interrupt politely so that we can then open up to the floor for questions and answers. And as always, I encourage you to think carefully about those questions. We'd rather that you avoided commentary and statements, and we'd like you to focus on succinct questions so that we can have as many questions as possible from the floor. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests, the Honourable Kevin Rudd and Terry Moran AC.
Kevin, you would have noticed that Barry Jones is in the audience, and if there hadn't been mention of this perhaps being a first in our constitutional history, I wouldn't have been game enough to draw attention to it, because undoubtedly Barry knows or will now find another occasion on which a Prime Minister and a Secretary had a conversation. But Barry, I'll do your deal. We'll just keep it between the three of us when you come up with that.
I'm more interested in what Terry was like as an undergraduate in La Trobe University in the late 60s. That would have been fun to see. How long was your hair?
Well, at one stage I had this massive frizzy afro and a big beard.
Photograph?
Well, I'm not sure I can find it.
It wasn't in your application form when I appointed you as Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department.
That's right, that's right.
So 67 you would have been in...
my book.
Say again?
Read chapter 3 of my book.
If you haven't bought Barry's book, whichever one he's referring to, buy it and read chapter 3.
Okay, okay.
But the 67, you would have been in that whole international New Left movement.
Oh, that's not quite how I'd put it, but...
Huh?
That was... 67 was before we were infected by the incubus from Monash.
Okay. So when Paris and the rest of them were on the march, you were in the cafeteria, is that right?
Oh no, I was being, as Don Watson later described it, moderate and avuncular. Kevin, we've decided to ask a few questions to prompt some discussion, and I'll begin with the first one, but we hope that they may end sooner than expected, so there'll be more time for any questions that you might have, and we'll get to that in 40 or 45 minutes. Kevin, why do you think the conversation we're having nationally about where the country is going is so narrow?
I think if you look at the big questions facing this country's future at the moment, I don't live here, so I come back from time to time. I live in the United States now for the last 3.5 years. So it's a partial perspective. And so I'm very conscious of what I miss in the periods that I'm not here. But if you look at the really big questions which seem to me to stand out for a country like ours in the midst of the challenges which we are facing globally and internally, like what is this country's future in Asia with the rise of China, beyond the tabloid debate we now see about Australia-China, which is kind of good cops, bad cops debate, as opposed to something which is properly textured and sensible about this massive economic entity simultaneously being a one-party state, which shares very few of our political values. How do we manage that for the next 35 years? I would say that's quite a large question. And secondly, the big one, which seems to float on and off the agenda here, which is our country's and the planet's sustainability against the challenge of climate. And then thirdly, what we see here and elsewhere in the Western community of democracies, which is the unravelling of a democratic fabric to some extent, which is a product of the fractures in the social contract in the country, because the economy is delivering for some but not for all. And this has been, as we discussed earlier on ABC Radio, it's the outworking of a project which has been underway now in neoliberal economics for the last 30, 35 years. So these are big ones, which if you stand back and look at the country that my kids and grandkids will share and take partnership in and develop, these should form the absolute core of our national conversation at the moment. This is beyond Indigenous reconciliation, the things that I've spent so much of my life on. These are big ones. So why is the space limited for that? I think it's this combined toxic relationship between professional politics and the professional media, which constantly narrows the bandwidth of the conversation and the time permitted for any substantive conversation beyond good cop, bad cop, hurling of abuse in a 2-hour media cycle. And so what happens is the political process, listening to their media masters, says, I've got to produce monosyllabic zingers in order to make myself communicate, which traduces the complexity of the debate down to sound bites and sub-sound bites. And then our friends, or should I say often foes in the media, led by the Murdoch stable, who will tabloidise everything, including the most complex conversations which require long and textured conversation. So there is a toxic, what I describe as mutual relationship. And if someone from the political class steps outside of that, as you know from our experience in public policy together, you're automatically ridiculed as being some pointy-headed intellectual. And so the safest thing to do is to stay within the very narrow parameters of the Punch and Judy show, term you used earlier today in our discussion, of day-to-day politics. So we've got massive inflection points globally and nationally at the moment around economic sustainability and China and the changing global order. Yet this decreasing bandwidth within the country and our capacity to even focus, discuss, resolve and chart a new course of action. So the responsibility, I say, is shared between my class, the political class, and the media class, and both of us do not serve the nation. Now, you, my friend, have, of course, come from a position of supreme detached wisdom, because you're a public servant. There are those of us who are in there in the Punch and Judy show, and you are sitting to one side going, tut tut, Minister, that was very political of you. Not that you ever said that to me in office, because you said every time I saw you after question time, well done, Prime Minister. He didn't really.
I did occasionally.
Occasionally. But From where you sit, and particularly here in the People's Republic of Victoria, and you folk are supposed to be serious intellectuals down here, as Homer Simpson would say. What is the bandwidth for a conversation here? This is in the city of Melbourne, where you pride yourself in having some of the country's best universities. You pride yourself in having a public intellectual culture. What's the bandwidth for the conversations around our future national life here?
Well, the bandwidth's there, but it's poorly exploited. If you look back to the Second World War, we came out of that with rebuilding the nation, which Curtin and Chifley started. Menzies actually continued it, as did Holt. And then at about the time that Holt died, which is just after I'd gone to university, that all fell apart because we were starting to worry whether we had a future. Lee Kuan Yew had said we were going to become the white trash of Asia. Donald Horne rather ironically spoke of the lucky country. And for 15 years we had a major all-in debate involving academics, economists, journalists, some newspapers, including what are now in the Murdoch stable, some government agencies like Treasury and the old Tariff Board and what it became over time. And eventually after 15 years the answer was reform driven by economics. And that arrived...
67 to 83.
Yeah, and that arrived in time for the Hawke government to then pick it up and firstly make some major reforms based around macroeconomics, and then proceeded down the path of very wide-ranging reforms driven by microeconomics. And many good things came out of that, and the country had an economy that grew wonderfully and expanded our collective wealth, but a lot of people missed out. And it was probably more than 20%, it was probably 40% or more who thought that somehow or other all this had happened and they hadn't really found that their lives had become that much easier. And a lot of the things that everybody was proud of by way of microeconomic reform, 80s, 90s and so forth, were not working. So for example, in the last few weeks we've come to terms with what Rod Sims, the chair of the ACCC, has been saying about how deficient the energy market is. But we've got a whole range of outsourced government services at the Commonwealth level which simply don't work. Aged care, I'm terrified in 30 years' time of needing to be dependent upon the aged care system if it's still the same. Vocational education and training has been trashed, and you and I spent quite a lot of time in our past lives on that very issue. Employment services aren't working. Early childhood development is not working. And so every area of social policy that the Commonwealth has got into, they've either wrecked or made less effective than it ought to be, or put charges on that households have got to pay. Now, everybody makes an assumption that the public aren't paying attention, that they've got this skittish view of everything, but the reality is, after 30 years in a variety of positions of seeing the best attitudes research that money can buy, which is what happens in many central agencies around Australia, I'm with Bob Hawke, who said that the public are actually quite bright, they know what's going on. And the public at the moment is giving the thumbs down to the product of microeconomic reform. But the public doesn't know what's needed, and the politicians haven't realised that there needs to be another big national debate about where do we go from here, because more of the same is not going to work. And the Brits are further down this track than we are. So recently, a very prominent Tory minister, Michael Gove, gave a major speech in London, I think, called Good and Bad Capitalism. And this was after a huge corporation called Carillion that had been the recipient of outsourced government services and employed 50,000 people to do things that previously had been done by public servants, went bankrupt because it had just tendered for things that it couldn't deliver at the price which the government was prepared to pay. We're heading down the same path, but we're insulated from what's happening in other countries. And so I think that it's not necessarily down to the political class to stir up a debate, because that debate between the late 60s and the early 80s was principally driven outside the political class. There were some politicians involved, but it was a much broader constituency. And maybe it's a problem with the media at the moment, or something else.
Well, let me go to you.
But all the others aren't jumping in with their view of the future.
A lot of that debate, in my recollection, because I was a junior woodchuck during the period of the debate that you're referring to. I was barely out of short pants. I just joined the Foreign Service when the debate you talked about was concluding. But your career has primarily been in the public service. So much of that debate into the 80s as well was actually conducted within the, let's call it, the circle of a pretty advanced Australian mandarinate. You had some very serious public service mandarins around the country, federal, state. If you put 30 of them in a room, you basically had the best brains trust that you could find anywhere in the nation. And these folks conducted the debate. They were given some latitude for doing that by their political masters, and that's how the political consensus was formed around that period of economic reform and allied social reform in the 80s and 90s that you referred to. So, roll the clock along. Here we are in 2018. The state of the public service today and its capacity, given all the constraints, all the, shall I say, distractions of day-to-day politics, and the ping-pong match between politicians and the media, and which scandal where and who, what, where and why. But underneath that is the bureaucratic class. Let's call it the econocrats, the bureaucrats, the social policy bureaucrats, that bunch of bright folks, aided and abetted by think tanks, etc. Are they up to this task?
Well, if you look at the Australian public service first, it's only the smaller part of total Commonwealth employment. Many more people are employed outside the public service in a large number of fairly independent agencies, each with their own act, usually each with their own ability to employ staff. I'm thinking here of the Reserve Bank or the ACCC or APRA and many others. There are well over 100 of them. In those areas, everything's, generally speaking, in pretty good shape. As you can see from the ACCC's contribution last week on energy, they've broken through with two papers that have summed up the problems that we've created for ourselves.
But they're not policy agencies.
Correct. Then you've got the departments of state, principally based in Canberra, and there'd be, 40 or 50,000 public servants in Canberra doing the work. And the national security area is also in very good shape. You might have a different view, I'm not sure, I didn't ask, but I think the national security area is very good, and I'd include in that even...
We introduced some reforms in this area, my friend.
Yes, but there have been some later ones, like Home Affairs, which some people in the room wouldn't approve of, but I actually think they're competent at doing what the government expects them to do, and they're well led by Mike Bazzullo, so I'll put that on the table. But after you take out national security, you're left with domestic policy, largely social policy. And in that area, the Commonwealth is all thumbs, and I wouldn't trust them with organising a collection of funds to build a local church. Because in the last 30 years, those areas have got rid of, in health, education, elsewhere, any substantial number of people who actually know how those big systems work, and brought in instead lots of microeconomists and generalists. I should say I was recruited to be a generalist, and I'm probably still one, but I think you can have too many generalists. And in those departments, the answer to almost any problem is create a market, frame a market, put a price on it, and go for light-handed regulation. And wherever possible, also outsource, not only service delivery, but also core government functions. So I think we've got into the position where those parts of the public service have learned institutional stupidity. This is in Canberra, and they simply don't have a clue about how the big systems in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and elsewhere actually work. And that's the problem that ought to be the focus in the Australian public service. The Australian public service is not in my view, irredeemably screwed all over. It's just that specific part of it that has been eroded and corrupted.
What about the economic bureaucracy, though? You've talked about the social policy bureaucracy.
Well, Treasury was the mainstay, and it was, as what you were talking about before, the entity that was activated to contribute to a debate, along with what became the Reserve Bank and some of the agencies then attached to Treasury. I think Treasury now has still got lots of capable people in it, and I think the new Secretary of Treasury should be given a chance to do what he can, because I know him, he's a very good person, and he did a very good job as Secretary of Treasury in New South Wales for 4 years. But they don't have the mandate to think thoughts about where the country is going and feed those into a national debate, and that's part of the problem.
And your old department, Prime Minister's, it's supposed to be the policy think tank of the nation?
I think Martin's doing a good job at rebuilding it after a rough time. And my only problem is there are too many economists in it, but there you go. I've already displayed my prejudice there. You need more people in that department as well who know how things work on the ground.
So there's a point at which you've got, let's call it, the bureaucratic class engaged in a very granular debate, or should be in a granular debate, about a series of quite specific economic, social and environmental reforms. That should be the case. I'm out of the country now. I don't know whether that's underway. That should be the case, hence my question as to whether it's still staffed and still incentivised to do that. But above that, you've got the grand debates, let's call it the macro debates about the country's direction. And on that one, my reflection from outside the country these days is Australia from the outside sometimes looks like, you know, a bunch of chooks with their heads cut off running around in a circle about some of these big debates. The China one I'm most familiar with because I've just observed it most closely. I'm a sinologist by training. I look at these things quite closely in this country together with 20 or 30 other countries. But when I look for the capacity for a mature conversation about that, I find it sadly lacking. We seem to have, taking this example further, we have a bunch of folks over here who want to put their head in the sand and say there is no problems at all with China as a one-party state rewriting the rules of the global order. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of people over here who are saying there are Reds under every bed. And that was, I think, in my judgment, the political import of Turnbull's statement at the end of last year, where he said the time had come for the Australian people to stand up against the Chinese hordes, which basically was a very provocative statement for the Chinese Australian diaspora within this country, for those of us who remember what it was like back in previous decades, but also polarising in terms of the real conversation to be had. So when I look at the ability for Australia to have a serious textured conversation about how do we handle a global order where we are now in transition from an America which is out to lunch at best, and if Trump is re-elected, a lot worse than that, someone who is accelerating the fracturing of the existing global rules-based system, a China under Xi Jinping which is very happy with itself and very happy with its rising economic power, extending geopolitical influence, while the observation in Beijing is the West is collectively self-immolating. Brexit, fracturing of German domestic politics, Southern Europe a mess, and the United States kicking a series of own goals. This is such a big debate for a country like Australia where 30% of our trade is with China. Our principal security relationship with the United States is the range of very big decisions to be made about where we position ourselves for the next quarter of a century requires the most sophisticated national conversation, which will take some time, but devoid, one would hope, of just mindless polemics. So again, I'm actually not following the granularity of the domestic debate. What I see in the United States is it's radically polarised in one direction, which is now let's eliminate the China threat. I don't know how it's going to resolve here, and I'm not really party to it other than when I write the occasional opinion piece. So you said before that the national intelligence community in Canberra is in reasonably good shape. Foreign interference laws, which I've not studied the text of. I don't know your views on that. But your assessment, having chaired the Secretary's Committee on National Security, ironically called scones in Canberra, by the way.
And we used to have scones for morning tea. So
these guys get together with all the spooks, everyone else, defence, armed forces, and foreign affairs, and they'd have scones once a week, and he's the head of scones. And so he was both jam and cream.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks.
Jam and cream put together. The scones type community, absent political leadership in this debate, can they conduct it and can they resolve it? In other words, what is the machinery for resolving internally and with the country at large our national China strategy for the future?
Just as domestic policy made a huge investment in economists, particularly microeconomists, to do the whole show over, and it hasn't all worked, the national security community made a huge investment in America. And so I observed that they all kept trooping off to America and coming back, and they were incredibly well networked. And this was really important to our security, but it meant that we were already blinkered in dealing with China. So although the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade was previously our ambassador to China, some of you know Francis Adamson.
Yeah, I sent it.
Generally speaking, the whole machine is still American-oriented, and it isn't coming up with the new ideas in this area that are needed to better engage with China, listen to China more carefully, not be paranoid about China and how it might be painted as it was in the 50s and 60s here in Australia. And that has to change, but arguably it's not registering much yet on the domestic political scene, and so the timing of that change is going to be more dictated by what happens internationally. Personally, I'm really worried about America's fortitude into the future. Can observe that China is now more single-minded than ever before, and we've got to dance with the two of them.
It's like one of those inflection points I think we faced. This says it too dramatically. In 41, where suddenly there was this national wake-up call in Australia, curtains look to America, etc. That happened quite dramatically. This is a slow burn effect, and it depends where American politics ultimately lands. But when I come back here to Oz, the impression I get is that the strategic urgency of this considered national debate is not evidenced in the Punch and Judy show around Chinese businessmen giving donations to political parties. That should be dealt with by the law enforcement authorities. People break the law, they should suffer the consequences. End of story as far as I'm concerned. That's quite different to where this country is in a China-heavy Asia in the 21st century. That is fundamental for us.
Yeah. So we're in danger as a country of missing our main chance, which is China and the rest of Asia. In the rest of Asia, India is incredibly important as well. And it's partly because there's a an assumed political gain from being tough with China in Australia, and partly because too many parts of the public service have frankly got a few blinkers on that ought to be taken off. Blinkers that point their eyes mainly in the direction of America and its policies. So when America is reasonably a source of worry for us, we've got to lay off the bets and pay more attention to China, listen more attentively to China.
On the question of sustainability, climate change, renewable energy, carbon pricing, and action around the world, and then almost the domestic subset of that, but also profound in its own right, is the rolling discussion about national population policy in our own country. Again, going to the sophistication of our political class, our media class, and our business community to deal with that one. Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the climate change problem is not going to be solely down to government. So I didn't mention to tell this, I didn't remember to tell you this, but the Centre for Policy Development that you mentioned before, in which I chair, the CEO had this great idea of getting a QC's opinion on the responsibility of directors of corporations from a risk management point of view in the face of climate change. And the QC's opinion was absolutely forthright that they have an obligation to consider the risks. And then we organised a roundtable which included some prominent business figures. Before the Banking Royal Commission, former High Court Judge Hayne was part of it. And they all had a road to Damascus. And then APRA's come in, ASIC's come in, and they're giving speeches now saying directors have a responsibility to examine the risk arising from climate change affecting their particular firm. And so it's leveraging unexpected sources of authority, like the statutory settings for corporations, that can actually take you somewhat further in that direction. But we're not having the debate because the debate's been stifled by essentially puerile attack politics directed at those who want to say that climate change is a real problem and we've got to get onto it or we'll be in real strife.
What causes us to lurch onto the media, I think. If we're talking about our future national life as a nation, and politics being the vehicle for our democracy to have the discourse, the state of the Australian media and its capacity to contribute or otherwise to constrain a productive national conversation about the big questions of the future. And so if we look at climate, for example, if we look at China, climate and the future, let's call it, of neoliberalism. You were talking about the offshoots of that in terms of what's gone wrong with microeconomic reform in the country. On those three big debates, we live in a country which 2/3, 70% of the print media is owned by Murdoch. And the ideological position of the Murdoch press is pretty plain on all three of those. One, Red's under the bed on China. Two, climate change is a global hoax, and that's Murdoch's position. And anyone who's engaged in the business of carbon pricing is going to destroy the economy. And then three, on the economic question, then it's still all the way with Hayek, all the way with Friedman, and all the way with what I describe as market fundamentalism. And anyone who critiques that is automatically assaulted. So given the structure of the Australian media, that those folks between them have a demonstrable, recorded, documented ideological agenda on all three of those propositions, and they therefore have an ability to shape the debate which occurs beyond the Murdoch stable through the national electronic media. Are we at a point where we are simply being suffocated in our ability to conduct that conversation? Or is it your view, because you live here and I'm not here anymore, is it through ABC, through what's left of Fairfax, and I mean that, what's left of Fairfax, and things like The Conversation, and other good initiatives are filling the void, or are we simply drifting into, let's call it a defeated conversation on those three big questions?
Well, I think they're filling the void, but only for about 10% or slightly more of the population. And the real issue is what happens to everybody else, who are just targets for fear-mongering and simplicity. What I would like to ask you on this point is, you see occasional reports in Australia of the Democratic Party in the United States starting to go local again and trying to work up support for particular positions in neighbourhoods, in communities. And there was a primary contested in New York recently, where a young
Queens.
female activist came through. But the mayor of Los Angeles is an example of somebody who is getting out there and sort of really addressing people at the level of community and using the resources of government to do that. So the real question I'd ask is there a sign in America that you can go around all the objectionable hysteria created by some parts of the media and do it in a different way, an old-fashioned way?
What's happening in the United States, which I'm a little more confident talking about in detail than I am about Australia these days, because I live there, is there are profound parallels with here, though some differences. The parallel, without labouring my point before, is the sheer power of Fox in the United States, which is owned and deployed and abused by Rupert, and for 30 years now. And it had a profound effect on that whole subculture of American politics, which gave you at one stage the all government is bad school of American politics, Contract with America, Newt Gingrich. Then it gave you the Tea Party, and out of the failure of the Tea Party came the Trump Party and Trumpology, and that whole phenomenon today. And that's all occurred within the echo chamber of the right, far right, which is a conversation among itself, which is the real danger, because it's no longer a conversation with the country. Similarly, in my job as head of the Asia Society in New York, I'm often interviewed by Fox, talking about US-China stuff, interviewed by CNBC, Bloomberg, and all these other folks. And it's like you are entering into an entirely different conversation, each one of those interviews that you have. There is no longer a common basis for a national conversation. And I'm just talking about the China question as it confronts America. The only other things they interview me on are like gun control and God knows whatever else. But by and large, it's symptomatic of the problem when the conversation is captured within a large subculture of the country. There's no longer a common platform for discourse. And so when I look at the reaction to that in the United States now, you're absolutely right to point at what's happened, in the last US presidential election, the primaries on the Democratic side with Bernie Sanders, which is a massive grassroots movement. People just fed up with that and reacting to it. And I went to some of the Bernie rallies just to observe.
To feel the burn.
Yeah, to feel the burn. And there was one in Union Square, not far from where I live. And Teresa and I wandered down there one day, and we just sort of taken aback by this combustion. If you remember what happened with Occupy Wall Street some years ago, this was like Occupy Wall Street had become turbocharged. And so what's happened after the presidential elections, the election of Trump, and Fox's rolling triumphing of the Trump victory on a daily basis, so you've got to see it to understand what it's like there, is the anger within the Democratic Party base across the United States is such that there's a re-radicalisation of the base. And in the primary you referred to in New York, just across the river from where we are, in Queens, this young woman, 28 years old, a Sanders activist, purely through grassroots activity, and quite a brilliant young political leader, turfs out a pre-existing congressman serving his 7th or 8th term, who himself is from the liberal left of the party, a strong liberal left standard bearer. So at that level, you could say there is an activist response. There is an organised response which is happening at a community level and in reaction to, let's call it, a domination of the media conversation by the likes of Fox and others. But here's my question. When I see this activist response, is it one which can deal simultaneously with the big questions of America and China, America and climate, America and the future direction of its economy, and the incremental appeal of Dodd-Frank and the laws brought in to constrain banking abuses, which they brought in, and we brought in similar arrangements here after the global financial crisis? I'm not sure about that.
Well, my answer to that point would be that people out there in the community have got to get stirred up around something, and their own interests are more than likely to be the ones that they get stirred up about. And then out of that, because every organisation these days accumulates huge numbers of email addresses and you can communicate with people, it's then a question of whether you exploit that to set up new channels to get the information out. A few years ago, I was invited...
But can I interrupt? On that on that, let's call it, balkanisation of views and turbocharged by social media, that's all fine, you know, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. But there's a parallel public policy worry in the back of my head is, given that you've got a number of massive macro questions, such as the future of the global rules-based order, America, China, which affects the United States fundamentally, the future of the planet, sustainability and what's going to happen in the regulatory framework, and the future of the global financial system and the economy, given what's happening with the winding back of some of the post-GFC changes. Can this atomised response from the grassroots up deal with those big questions? That's what I don't know. I know that it's a valid local political response to the abuse of political power and media power, but this is my worry.
Well, I agree with you about the power of the Murdoch media in America and here, but I'd say that a few years ago I was invited to a conference in New York, paid for by Mayor Bloomberg, for 30 local cities, and Bloomberg, who's deeply impressive, and he introduced me to Bette Midler, so he's doubly deeply impressive.
I saw her recently on Broadway. She was in Hello Dolly. She's great.
Yes. Anyway, Bloomberg got up at this conference and said, look, in America, there were people from all over the world. In America, Washington is a mess. It's just hopeless. And the future of the things that matter is in cities. It's at the local level. And I think we're not as extreme in our problems in Australia as perhaps is the case in America. But I would argue that we've got to take stuff at the local level more seriously, not just for delivery of services, not just for sorting out problems, not just for providing people some focus for cohesion in their lives within a community, but also, frankly, as an educational tool to start to get an alternative view out about how you can see the world. So if the national security community in Canberra is overinvested in America, that's not going to change in the next decade rapidly. There has to be some other means by which we start to acquaint Australians with everything else that's going on in the world that's nearby, China and the region, and talk about what needs to be done. And I don't think the Fairfax media, however well-intentioned, is going to get very far. News Corp's just going to be hysterical. And I think it's got to be something that's far more local. And that fits in, that's prompted by your point about the wonderful city of Melbourne and how it cares about these things.
Well, it does actually. I mean, I like Melbourne. I always have. It's been my favourite Australian city for a long time. And I say that as a native of Queensland, because you take public affairs seriously in this city.
Now,
in a way which you don't see as uniformly in the other large cities of the country. There's a public policy culture here which is less evident elsewhere.
so before we now go to questions from the floor, could I ask you one final trick question
Sure.
while we get ready for questions from the floor? If the global financial crisis, which was subjected to a strategy that your government developed, if that strategy hadn't been used, what would Australia be like now?
I think you remember you and I were in a meeting which was the emergency cabinet meeting of October 2008, 10th anniversary of which is coming up soon, where we sat for an entire weekend looking at three sets of options really. One which is often the preferred Sir Humphrey option, which is not that you were Sir Humphrey, but you were. But this was not your option, Sir Humphrey. I was the minister at this stage. State government level, I'd been Humphrey as well.
Yes, yes. So you know all the tricks.
I know all the tricks, yeah. I was Bernard for a while as well. But
So was I, actually,
when were you Bernard?
in the 80s.
All right. Who were you Bernard to?
John Cain.
Good God.
Yeah.
There you go. So multi-skilled, multi-talented. But in that cabinet meeting of October 2008, there were three sets of options. The classical Sir Humphrey option, which was the world's falling apart, our financial system's falling apart, we could do nothing and see what happens. It's funny, when you're in a public policy environment, it can be like that. You'll have a very elegant analysis of gloom, doom and destruction, but we should wait and see, okay, until you see the tidal wave come in the back window, and then you know it's possibly a little late. Option two, which is kind of along the lines of, here are a couple of urgency measures we can take, and then let's sit back and see what happens. And in our case, those two urgency measures were, one, providing a sovereign guarantee for everyone's bank deposits in the country, and two, providing a sovereign guarantee for the interbank lending of all of our banks in the country, international interbank lending. Because to sustain the credit operations of this country, a large part of that each day, each week, is sourced from abroad. And so...
and at the time, the banks were a bit short of the readies.
They were short of the readies, yeah. And so this was an existential discussion. I remember saying to the cabinet colleagues at the time, I said, well, welcome to the second Scullin government. It didn't work out so well for Jim in 31. I don't think it's going to work out well for us either. He was elected in 29, of course, about 1 week before the Wall Street crash of that year, which culminated in the Depression. And so it's an existential moment if you're the Prime Minister saying, just sign here on these two guarantees, not knowing whether they're going to work. Because we've faced rumours of a rush on the banks on the following Monday, and we knew that some of the banks themselves, in terms of their credit facilities abroad, were now highly constrained because the foreign banks were contracting their balance sheets and their exposures to defend their financial position back in the United States or back in London. So we did that, and you may recall, having made the decision, we then went out and announced it. Then there was what I'd describe as the big unknown set of questions, which is the Treasury saying to us, and this comes directly to what would have happened if we hadn't done the above, is, well, thanks for doing that, Prime Minister, that's really good, but we're still going to have a recession. I said, oh, that's not good news at all. And remember Ken said that. And I said, how big? He said, oh, reasonable. And I said, how's reasonable is reasonable? And he said, well, you know, we're looking at unemployment with an 8 in front of it and heading north of that. I said, that's a problem. And he said, but it's just too big. And so I said, but Ken, if we didn't want to have a recession, given what's happening, what would we have to do about it? This led to the conversation which some of you may have heard before about when I asked Ken to reflect on economic history, the real importance of having historical continuity within the professional public service of our country, people with collective institutional memory of previous crises. Ken's response was, well, in terms of fiscal stimulus, you have to go hard, you have to go early, and you have to go households in order to prop up domestic demand to prevent a collapse in economic activity, which then has the feed-on consequences for employment. And that stage for 2.5 months before Christmas. So that was a really hard one, as you know, and that led to the first of 3 stimulus strategies. So what would have happened if we'd not done any of the above? We would have had a run on 1 or 2 of the banks the following Monday. We would have seen the bank's ability to extend credit to businesses, including small businesses, for their normal financing operations dry up within that month. And as for the impact on the real economy, had we not then gone to stimulus, I took Kennedy's word. We would have then looked, I think, at our normal performance in a recession, which was in fact unemployment levels of 10.
Yeah.
And that's the historical number. So the advantage of that, even though this was not, shall I say, laying out the vision splendid for the sunlit plains extended for future vision for Australia, this is just an exocet which hits you from the left, was to say, because we had a professionally experienced bureaucracy, they could answer these questions.
2 points on that. Treasury, to its credit, had done scenario planning well in advance of a number of possibilities, including this one. And so they weren't just talking off the top of their head. They were talking on the basis of quite sophisticated analysis. Secondly, the thing that struck me about what happened then and subsequently with the later stimulus packages was rather than the nation coming together, the nation fell apart at the political level because everything that was done was crudely used as a point of criticism of the government of the day. Often, frankly, I can say this, you wouldn't want to, on the basis of quite blatant lies by prominent people on the other side of politics. And I think that plays into the mix of what's wrong with politics in Australia at the moment. That at that point, we started down the track of Tea Party style politics, and we've never managed to find a route out of that particular point of difficulty. That's my view.
You could say that, Terry. I couldn't possibly comment.
That's supposed to be my
What a
line.
great segue to Q&A, gentlemen. So we've canvassed a number of challenges so far this evening, and there has been one challenge thrown out at you as an audience, and that is that the nation is in need of a mature, textured conversation. I think we've had a fantastic foundation built this evening, but I'm confident that we have an audience here, gentlemen, who are capable of such a conversation. As I said, we would ask that you keep your questions focused, succinct, and that will mean that we have a number of questions before we finish up this evening. So, who's going to open the bidding?
A recent Lowy Institute poll showed that less than 50% of young Australians believe that democracy is the best form of government. I'm really curious to see what both of you think about this in terms of Australia's future and in terms of answering those 3 big questions that, Kevin, you proposed before in terms of China, the breakdown of neoliberalism, and climate change.
All of the surveys are pretty dismal about all people's trust in our democracy. That's just one part of it. And the good news is that quite a number of government institutions are rated very highly in trust terms, RBA being an example, the ABC being another one. They get knockout results, and there are quite a few of them. But I think that the situation of young people is a result of a combination of things. Firstly, neoliberal reforms have left many of them hanging out there trying to figure out how to get a decent career underway following whatever educational experiences that they've had, and thus feeling very insecure, and after a few years the gig economy, unable to borrow to buy a home and all that sort of stuff. Secondly, along the way, most of them probably missed a decent introduction to our system of government and how it works. So it has faults, it always has had faults in my view, but the truth is, compare us with America, and we are in tip-top shape compared to the American political system. But people don't manage to get that message when they go to school or perhaps even go to university, and so there's an information and understanding gap that's not being overcome. And then finally, the politicians all being in a bubble created by a continuing adherence to out-of-date ideas driving policy, i.e. neoliberalism, aren't really communicating honestly with them about the problems that young people perceive they have and how they might be dealt with, and what's more, aren't even really listening to what they've got to say.
Kevin?
Just a thought in response to that is that I think we, the political class, have a large responsibility for this disillusionment on the part of younger people with the validity of the democratic project. And a friend of mine in the United States said this to me last week, and I hadn't really thought of it in these terms before, that within the many, many disruptions that are occurring at the moment within Western democracies, in parts on questions of race, in parts of questions of economic distribution, and the people Hillary unfortunately called deplorables, who voted for Trump. But also this person said to me something interesting about young people, that there was a new emerging conflict between younger Americans and older Americans, younger people in the West and older people in the West, between parents and their kids, and not over the classic conservative liberal social attitudes question. That's a generation past. My generation's very funky on those sort of questions. My kids would cringe to hear me say that, but they cringe anyway. But no, the point is that my colleague in America was making is that they seriously no longer see themselves as having the same economic opportunities and financial opportunities as us. And this is breeding a new anger and disillusionment on the part of young people towards established policy and politics and the failure of the system to deliver to them. Dig down into it again. In the United States, it means that my ability to find my pathway to the future through higher education is now becoming so unaffordable in America through student debt that it's been closed off. And there is even less pathway to class mobility than there was in the days prior to the introduction of the GI Bill after the Second World War. Now, university fees here are not as great as they are in the United States, but what I worry here is the emergence of a parallel track, is that people, young people, not seeing this as their pathway to the future anymore because it's so expensive, and B, that because of a range of other factors, their ability to get a toehold in the future through basic questions like housing affordability is no longer available to them. So this is breeding a deep anger on the part of young people, and as a consequence, a deep, personally felt disillusionment with the capacity of organised politics to be in any way relevant to them.
All right, we have 3 in a queue. I've got one gentleman on the end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dennis O'Neill from Foundation 1901. 3 great, magnificent questions, but from an Australian domestic perspective, perhaps a 4th. You spoke about the inability to have mature conversations. You referred to the Washington swamp. Many in this country might see an equivalent billabong in Canberra. And indeed, that was reflected in the comment about Canberra not understanding aspects of how the states really function. Given that lack of maturity for an effective conversation, or lack of mature capacity for a mature conversation, if we go back to the reasons why this country federated and how it federated, and given that Canberra, originally the progeny of a mature conversation within and among the states of the time, is now the cashed up parent, has the balance altered graphically in the last 120 or so years? And do we need to have another very serious and mature conversation about where that balance between the Commonwealth and the states should reside over the next 25 years or more?
Do you want me to go first?
Yes, mate.
I think we have a similar view, actually. You're absolutely right. On domestic policy, the Commonwealth fumbles. It doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't even follow what's happening with its own programs using the data that it has. And I say that because, again, mentioning the Centre for Policy Development, working with the Boston Consulting Group, we looked at what's happening to the humanitarian intake in Australia and how they are assisted or not assisted with employment services. And after 18 months, only 17% who want employment are in sustainable employment in that category of people. Disadvantaged Australians do better. That's 27%. So we've got to. That's one example of a system that is remotely orchestrated against pure economic logic and simply doesn't work. You can't do that if it's run locally, either at a state level or at a local government level. And the debate we need to have is how we can decant stuff out of Canberra and either using money in a creative way, do it at the state level, or rethink local government and do it at the level of local communities through local government authorities, not by amalgamating them or pursuing illusory efficiency, but basically by legislating to fix them up and giving them something decent to do rather than drains and rubbish.
I think when the history of our government is written, where Terry and I worked together, it will probably be recorded as one of the most activist federalist agendas that was being pursued. In the 3 years that we were in office, we probably met COAG about 10 times. The first meeting was within a month of the election in 2007 here in Melbourne.
At Government House.
At Government House.
And it thundered and stormed.
It thundered and stormed because the gods were pleased.
Oh.
I think. Or cross, I'm not sure. But I remember we established 7 working groups, each chaired for the first time. Well, first of all, it's the first COAG meeting ever to be held out of Canberra. My decision. 2, 7 working groups, each chaired by a Commonwealth Minister, with the Deputy Chair being from a state. 3, that for the first time we had Commonwealth working groups on health and ageing, on education, skills and training, on climate change, as well as on water and sustainability, deregulation. So we had this whole problem of non-complementarity of state and federal regulatory arrangements, and there were a couple of others as well. And these things became work engines for the subsequent 2 years. And what they produced, among other things, was the final sort of cut of the Murray-Darling Basin Agreement, which, despite current criticism, at least provided us with a mechanism for managing the water system on a collaborative basis with the states, with an ultimate decision by the regulator. This was a massive period of work. This bloke did most of it. And my job was to sweet talk the premiers.
Threaten, I think, was the...
Gently cajole is what we did together. And him firmly, myself diplomatically, given my training. But the bottom line is, I think we got it. Both Terry and I, he's from this fair state and I'm from the People's Republic of Queensland. And so we get it that federal bureaucrats do not effectively deliver programs which mean things to real people on the ground other than making payments to them through the payment system and payments and benefit system. And so therefore, how do you construct a system which has those roles and responsibilities clearly defined, the funding responsibilities clearly defined, and most critically, and we spent a lot of time on this, finalising a health agreement between the states and territories, which Abbott then subsequently killed, which would prevent the health budgets of the future crushing the future financial capacity of the states to do their job. And we did that through the reform we announced in April of 2010, about 2 months before I was hung, drawn and quartered by the factions. And then Abbott killed it about 2 to 3 years after that. But without doing that, the Federation could not work.
I think, just to add a point if I may, Australia could do with more Burkean-style institutional conservatives in federal politics who would instinctively have more respect for the Federation and would instinctively also have, I hope, more respect for local government, and realise that if the Commonwealth collects all the money, it doesn't mean that it has to be the provider of the services or the outsourcer of delivery to others. There are other ways of getting things done in a way that's much closer to people, and I think that's likely to be one of the big reform pushes over the next 2 or 3 decades.
So I think I was more Burkean than Abbott, minus the monarchy.
You were much more Burkean, and he
Just
was...
while you're having that argument, can we just make sure we get the microphone through to the middle here?
Kevin, right, to fill you in on the question that you've brought up, and you've told us what's happening in America with the dissatisfaction of young people, to fill you in what's happening here in Victoria.
Please make sure it's a focused question.
For the last number of years, yes, it is a very focused question. For the last number of years here in Victoria, centred at the Melbourne University, we have had a series of annual Marxist conferences in which very large numbers of young people have come forward, particularly led by young women, and collectively they have discussed politics in terms of Marxism, and it seems to me that the sort of conclusions they've come to in relation to your good work as Prime Minister would be the real problem arose because you didn't understand, or not you didn't understand, but they say the problem is capitalism and it's only a revolt against capitalism that will help us solve the real problems we've got.
Can you just answer that
and I
briefly?
think, can I just finish? I think what they would say was the mistake was to allow the banks the power to make money, and that has been the continuing problem we've had ever since, because banks produce money, that produces debt, and all these young people are caught now in a debt cycle that means that their whole lives, unless we do something about it, is going to be bogged down by this debt.
Thank
you may
you, sir.
agree with that
Yep.
from what you're seeing in the United States.
Thank you. Kevin, a response?
Just 30 seconds. There are 2 great debates in the global economic debate. One's between classical socialism and let's call it liberal capitalism. Capitalism won that debate against socialism, and I support capitalism winning that debate. Then the second debate is between whether that capitalism is social democratic capitalism or whether it is neoliberal capitalism. And I'm a social democratic capitalist, which means that the capitalist system has to have a bunch of conditionalities attached to it, which is a state prepared to intervene, to regulate markets, to engage in the economy when you have market failure, and beyond that to engage in key areas of delivery where in fact markets cannot properly perform. And it's that level of what I describe as properly constrained capitalism, what others call inclusive capitalism, which is the only pathway to the future. What we had in the final outworkings of the global financial crisis was exclusive capitalism, what I called in various things I wrote at the time, the considerable irritation of the Murdoch media as market fundamentalism. It reached its zenith when you had the financial implosions of 2007, utterly unregulated financial markets, nobody knowing who owed what to whom, in which financial institution, how much and when it was due, which caused a collapse in confidence in the system, and who ultimately paid the price of that, working people across the world through their taxes, having to engage in fiscal stimulus payments and provide guarantees necessary to keep the financial systems afloat. That's why I wrote what I wrote, and that's why I have quite defined views on the failures of that market fundamentalist approach.
Thanks, Kevin. A question here in the front, thank you.
My name is Laura Matiasi. Thank you.
Speak up a little.
Sorry, I was coughing before. Laura Matiasi. Thank you, La Chop, for giving me the opportunity to ask the prestiged panel a question. My question really around corporate governance, and I work for one of the major banks. I won't mention who, but a lot of a question that we're trying to find the answer is about how to restore that trust. And one of the, I think, recommended solutions really, the board up to the top, the senior management's got to set a tone. So my question to the federal politics in this regard, our government is there a role for government politicians to play the role to set a tone for the whole country? And if it is, what the tone we need to set to secure generations' prosperity to come?
Simple question.
I think the banks are in a bit of a bind, obviously, with the public. The extent to which they're trusted is the big ones. It's through the floor. And I think the only way they can rescue that is if they actually send out more authority to their outlets at the local level and try to get senior management and board members out there meeting with customers and staff at the local level to actually put their ear to the ground and hear what people are saying. But there's a bigger problem than the banks, which is that the concerted effort through the BCA and by other means by the large corporates in Australia on corporate tax reform basically shows that the people leading those organisations in Australia have simply lost sight of social licence and have lost sight of their obligations to the rest of the community, and their only interest in policy is if it further liberalises the restraints that remain on not only banks but other corporations as well. So I think that there's a whole lot of tinder lying on the ground waiting for somebody to put a spark to it and start a fire, which is about the place of large corporations in our society. I don't think you see much innovation in the large corporations. I think that they've disinvested in the skills formation of their employees over 10 or 15 years, and therefore the suggestion that if they get tax cuts for the large corporates, they'll suddenly innovate and create more jobs. If you go by the American experience, it's more than likely that they'll remit more profits to overseas shareholders to get around the deficiencies created by franking credits in the Australian taxation system. They'll buy back shares and do a whole lot of things other than turn their entities, whether they be banks or others, into dynamic, innovative organisations. Innovation in capitalism in Australia is more the province of SMEs, in my view, and that fact, if it's true, is a real problem for the future of the country, probably as big as the problems we face in our neglectful approach to China, as Kevin was talking about before. Now, if you're shocked as a bank manager or whatever, grab me afterwards, but I think that there's a delinquency in the large corporations that is in need of more notice.
30 seconds on the banks. You got to love the banks, Drag kicking and screaming into a Royal Commission they said they never needed. Secondly, to prevent it, suddenly discovering the virtues of engaging one of my former colleagues, Anna Bligh, a Labor Premier of Queensland, to become head of the Australian Bankers Association to try and persuade the Parliament not to have a Royal Commission. And thirdly, the Royal Commission then revealing what it's revealed about banking practices. All that reveals to the public, who are not dumb, what it reveals to the public is a culture of corporate arrogance on the part of the banking leadership of this country, which has revolted people. And I've got to say, having dealt with these folks during the financial crisis, where their dependency on you, the people, through we, the government, to save their bacon, has not been reflected or reciprocated in their behaviour back to you, the people, and you, the people who depend on the banks. And finally, a banking licence is a privilege extended by the Parliament of Australia. It is not a right. And the banks need to remember that.
Thank you very much. Over to my right.
Kevin, in 2009 you had a system of community cabinets, I think in local electorates. But did that work well, and do you think that could be used again in future government?
Yeah, Terry will have a different view on this because he had to organise them all. It was a bright idea of mine on the campaign trail in Townsville one day. And if you've been up to Townsville, how many of you have been to Townsville? Okay, thank you. About 10% of the audience. Not many people go to Townsville, and they should because it's a large city in North Queensland. So there's a lot of Australia which is outside of Sydney and Melbourne, and in terms of our thematic this evening, which is sustaining trust in our national institutions, my feeling, having grown up in regional Queensland, not even in Brisvegas, was we had to bring cabinet to communities. And not do it every week, but we tried to do it every month to 6 weeks around the country. By the time I left the Prime Ministership, we'd done about 24, 26 around the country. And these were, I think, for the communities that experienced them, vital engagements with local democratic life. I mean, if you're in the burbs of Townsville and the cabinet comes to down, you get 500, 600, 700 people from that community engage in every level of what government does. It is over time a cumulatively energising experience for people, and it's measured against the extent to which we then respond to what's put to us. Secondly, Terry's breed, the bureaucrats, then had to go to these places as well. And I know for a fact that not all of them liked it.
I did, Kevin.
Terry was fine, but let me tell you, look on the faces of some of our permanent heads who was, we're going to Wangaratta, and no, we didn't actually go to Wangaratta, but places like that around the country. So I think it's actually a good thing, and I'm sad that the subsequent Conservative government has not sustained the practice at all. There's something quite humbling about standing up in front of a group of 600 people in a place which is not in mainstream Australia. And these were not all sort of marginal seats. These were some safe Labor seats, some safe Conservative seats, and some up the middle. We were quite deliberate in the way in which we chose those things. But it's quite a vulnerable experience to stand up and just take it as it comes. It's all on live television too. So I think it's a good thing and we should do more of it.
Could I just say, I actually agree wholeheartedly with Kevin on this, because part of the problem with Canberra is that politicians in little groups or large groups simply seldom get out and tackle large groups of people from a local community about their problems. And I saw it work magically in the time of Kevin's government, just as I'd seen it work in other governments prior to that. That's the first point. Secondly, I can remember one...
Other state governments?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the first federal government to have done it.
I can remember one community cabinet particularly well. We went to Port Macquarie in New South Wales. And I can't remember what I was doing, but Kevin went out to the local hospital and encountered a group of clinicians who were really cross. And they said, in this hospital, the state government gives us X to do a particular operation, whereas our peers in Sydney doing the same operation get X plus a large percentage. It was 20 or 30% extra. And Kevin came back in a very focused way, and we then had a discussion about what to do
Way.
do about it, and that was what set us on the path for the reform of public hospitals in Australia, which was difficult, dealing particularly with Victoria, I might say, but it was a giant success, and it not only treated people as patients and as clinicians far more equitably than previously, but it set in train more accountability and more local authority over hospitals. Part of the deal was you had to move authority out of state government departments to local hospitals. And it was just one example of a really big, useful reform being prompted, in this case, by a group of specialists in a small New South Wales town or city who felt peeved at the way they were treated by the bureaucracy in Sydney. And there were more stories like that.
We could go on hearing these stories. It's been such a treat, and I know there are pressing questions around the audience, but I do need to draw this to a close very sadly. Can I say thank you so much, gentlemen, for allowing us into a conversation that has brought many insights, challenges. It's been provocative, and I know there are many other questions that you've raised, but you've canvassed a huge range of topics that will leave us thinking for many days to come, and it certainly has been a treat to have you together once again, breaking history and making history. So please join me in thanking our special guests, the Honourable Kevin Rudd and Terry Moran AC.
I hope that Robert will have us back again in 5 years' time.
Yes, indeed. And speaking of Robert, can I just add a couple more points? First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much to Emeritus Robert Mann for the organising of this event, and indeed a year's worth of very provocative subjects on this topic of can we make Australia better. I'd also like to thank our events team. So together, please join me in thanking Robert and the events team. And finally, as you can see behind me, we did touch on the topic of climate change, and true to our word, we're tackling those challenging subjects. So we look forward to seeing you at our next Ideas and Society event in September, when Tim Flannery will be our guest speaker on the topic of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here, for being part of a great conversation, and thank you again to our guests. Have a good evening. Thank you.